Hello there, Oak and Pine, and welcome to World Book Day. Today we're reading one of my favourite tales. It's wonderful because I am in it. Are you sitting comfortably? Well, let's begin. Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen. They were very happy, except for one thing. They longed to have children, but they had none. Now it happened one day when the queen had been bathing, that a frog crept out of the water and spoke to her. He said, "My queen, before the year has gone by, you shall have a daughter." The queen was delighted and hurried to tell her husband the news. Within a year it happened, as the frog had said. A baby daughter was born to the king and the queen, and they were filled with joy. The child was so pretty that everyone that came to see her cried, "What a beautiful baby!" The king was so proud of his baby daughter, he ordered a christening feast to be prepared. The king invited all of his friends to the feast. Kings, queens, princes and princesses from other kingdoms. Some good fairies lived in the land, and the king wanted them to be godmothers to his daughter. Now, there were 13 fairies, but one was a bit old. No one had seen her for many years. The king only had 12 golden plates. He invited just 12 of the fairies to the feast. The old fairy was not invited. When the christening feast was over, the good fairies went to the princess to give her magic gifts. The first fairy said, "You shall have a beautiful face." The second fairy said, "You shall think beautiful thoughts." The third fairy said, "You shall be kind and loving." The fourth fairy said, "You shall dance like a fairy." The fifth fairy said, "You shall sing like a nightingale." When 11 of the fairies had given their gifts, the baby had been promised everything in the world one could wish for. This is the best bit of the story. At that moment, the 13th fairy arrived. Can you see her? Isn't she wonderful? She was furious that the king had not invited her to the feast. Pointing at the baby, she cried in a loud voice, "When the king's daughter is 15 years old, she shall prick herself with a spindle and fall down dead." Without another word, she rushed out of the palace. All the people at the christening feast were silent with horror when they heard the words of the wicked fairy. The queen began to cry, and the king did not know how to comfort her. Then the 12th good fairy, who had not yet given the baby her gift, stepped forward. "Do not weep, dear queen," she said. "I shall do what I can to help. I cannot undo the evil spell, but I can soften it a little." "The princess will prick herself with a spindle," went on the 12th fairy, "but she shall not die. She shall fall into a deep sleep that will last for 100 years. The king thanked the fairy for her kindness, yet he did not want to think of his child sleeping for 100 years. So he gave orders that every spindle in the whole kingdom should be burned. His messengers were sent to every town and village to see that it was done. As time went by, the baby princess grew into a lovely girl. All the gifts that the good fairies had promised were hers. She had a beautiful face. She thought beautiful thoughts. She danced like a fairy, and she sang like a nightingale. She was happy and kind and loving, so that all that knew her loved her. The king and queen loved their daughter dearly. Now it happened that very day when the princess was 15 years old, the king and queen were not home. To amuse herself, the girl wandered all over the palace. She opened doors of dozens of rooms that she had never seen before. At last she came to an old tower. She climbed up the narrow winding staircase and found a little door at the top. She turned the rusty key in the door and it opened. There in the little room sat an old woman, at her spinning wheel busily spinning flax. "Good day, dear dame," said the princess. "What are you doing?" "I am spinning, my child," replied the old woman. "Oh, how wonderful!" cried the princess. "Please let me try." No sooner had the princess touched the spindle than the wicked fairy's words came true. She pricked her finger. As soon as she felt the prick of the spindle, the princess fell upon the bed in a deep sleep. The old woman fell asleep in her chair, and every other living creature within the palace also fell asleep. At that very moment, the king and the queen returned home for their daughter's birthday. They fell asleep in the great hall of the palace. The lords and the ladies who were with them fell asleep nearby. In the stables, the horses fell asleep. In the courtyard, the dogs stopped barking and fell asleep. On the roof, the pigeons stopped cooing and they fell asleep. On the palace walls, the flies stopped crawling and they fell asleep too. In the kitchen, the fire died out and the meat stopped cooking. The cook fell asleep, and so did the scullery boy. The whole palace became silent. Not a living creature moved. The wind dropped, and the trees in the palace garden, not a leaf stirred. A hedge of thorns sprang up around the palace and its gardens, and every year that hedge grew higher and higher and thicker and thicker. At last it grew so tall that it almost hid the palace. Only the topmost towers could be seen above it. The story of the beautiful princess who lay asleep spread throughout the kingdom and far beyond. She became known as Sleeping Beauty. From time to time, many princes journeyed to the palace hoping to awaken Sleeping Beauty. But the thorn hedge grew so quickly that none of the princes could force their way through it. After many years, a very handsome prince visited the kingdom. An old man had told the prince about the tale of Sleeping Beauty. When the prince heard the old man's tale, he said, "I must see this beautiful princess and try to awaken her." The prince walked into the silent palace. There the king and queen sat asleep on their thrones. All was quiet, so the prince felt that he should walk on his tiptoes. The prince wandered along the corridors. He looked in all the rooms he could find, but nowhere was Sleeping Beauty. At length the prince came to the foot of the highest tower. He began to climb the narrow, winding staircase. When he reached the door at the top, he pushed it gently open into a small room. There, on the bed, sleeping, lay the most beautiful maiden he had ever seen. For a long time he looked at her, and then he bent over and gave her a kiss. At that moment, Sleeping Beauty opened her eyes and she gave the prince a wonderful smile. Then she sat up quite wide awake. The prince gave her his hand, they stood up and together they went down the narrow winding staircase. At that moment the king and queen awoke from their sleep. They were so happy to see their daughter awake and well, and they welcomed the prince who had broken my spell. The palace had come to life again after its sleep of 100 years. Everyone in the palace was both astonished and delighted. Well, almost everyone. Around the palace, the high hedge of thorns had vanished. A wonderful wedding feast was prepared. The handsome prince was married to Sleeping Beauty. and they lived happily ever after. The end. I hope you enjoyed our World Book Day story. Who was your favourite character? I hope it was the Wicked Fairy.